All right, good morning and God bless you. Look at this title page for this title board for our lesson here, Romans. I was thinking a lot about what to call it in these documents that I'm uploading with all the information on these boards. And I finally settled on this. Let's call our study here the book of Romans, the redemption of man and the righteousness of God, because surely that does capture, well, I think anyway, the essence of what we find here in the great letter to the Romans. And what you're seeing here on the side, this is actually, that's a photograph. Something just popped up on my screen. There it goes. We're going to have some issues maybe for a little bit here this morning. Bear with us. That's a photograph of the first chapter of Romans in Sinaiticus, all the way back from the 4th century. So think about how this is over 1,500 years old, this document, one of the earliest copies that we have of the Scriptures and one of the most important. And that's the copy of the beginning of Romans. And as soon as the congregations, as soon as the house churches in Rome received it, that's what they would have done, is to begin to copy it. And so that to me is quite thrilling. Now, bear with me while I explain something once more about some of the features, some of the material from the class. If you go to watch the videos of the class, if you know anybody who's interested in it, there may be some watching this later, maybe way off into the distant future. Maybe somebody's watching from the year 4028. Did you ever think of that? We don't know, but I want you to know that you can have access to all these documents, everything that you see on the boards here. And, excuse me just a moment. All right, I apologize there. You might wonder, well, where can I get them? And there's a link to those of you who've been in my introduction to the Gospels class know that I have these uploaded to a Google Drive file that you can access. And if you go to the video, rather than me trying to text it or send it out to all of you like I was doing before, if you just go to the video, there's a little drop-down menu that you can see right here, just for those who don't know. And that when you click that, then it gives you more information in the description box below. And when you see that additional information, if you'll scroll up, see, it might not appear on your screen if you're on your phone or your tablet, on your laptop or whatever the case might be, but if you scroll up, then you'll see there at the bottom, there is that link in the description box right there. And so we want to be sure that you can find that if you're interested in having the material in these boards later. Okay. So we've been looking at the historical background to the letter. The basic questions like who wrote it and to whom was it written and from where and when. And so, of course, it was written by the Apostle Paul, and we talked about Paul last time and some things about Paul's background that are important to keep in mind when you read the letter. But I went back and found some more images, and I just wanted to show you something. I know maybe you get tired of all the artwork that I show, but look at how often Paul is depicted with the sword. You remember we talked about that? Well, it's a little bit hard to tell unless John or Jerry wanted to kill the lights for a minute. But he's holding a sword there with the Bible. Yeah, I like that. And then you see it here as well, the sword. Isn't it interesting that in all of these photos, look here, there is the sword. And so now, of course, you understand why that is, why you're always seeing the sword there, because it was customary to depict these great figures of Scripture in the way that they were martyred, with something in the image to indicate the way that they were martyred. That's a Rembrandt. That's a well-known picture of the Apostle Paul, or supposedly. And then here, yet another one with the sword. Well, let's summarize then some of these facts about Paul before we move on from who wrote the book. Thank you. Yeah, everything's kind of screwy this morning, so forgive me for all these delays. So we bear in mind, of course, we understand that Paul's a Jew, but remember this, and I think sometimes we forget this when we're reading the book of Acts and the epistles, that Paul was still a Jew, and when Jews embraced the gospel, when they became Christians, they still maintained their Jewishness and their Jewish practices. They didn't just suddenly start eating pork and start working on the Sabbath day and things like that. And so they still tried to maintain their Jewish identity and still felt conscientious about needing to keep all of these requirements of the law. We'll see how that comes into play in this letter later. And we pointed out he was born in Tarsus. That means outside of Palestine, and so he may have been Hellenized, although we'll see in a moment he was raised in Jerusalem. He was a Roman citizen. We learn from several texts in the book of Acts, and I know you can't read the small print with the passages there. That's why I'm making all this material available in the way that I explained a moment ago. He was raised in Jerusalem and trained by a prominent rabbi, and so that brings to mind the fact that he was a Pharisee who was zealous for the law. We find Paul talking about in Galatians 1, 13 and 14, when he looked back at how he persecuted the church, and he looked back at his conversion, and he talked about how he's zealous. He was exceedingly zealous in Galatians 1. For the traditions of my fathers. Well, you see how that becomes, that gives us some insight into what Paul's addressing in the book of Romans, because you had other Jewish Christians like Paul who were still that way in the church, even after all these years, even though it's been almost 30 years when Paul writes the book of Romans since Christ was crucified and raised from the dead. They're still very much practicing their Jewishness, if I can say it that way. And then as well, remember he was commissioned. This will help us appreciate some of the references in Romans 2. He was commissioned by Christ when Jesus appeared to him. He was personally commissioned by Christ to go to the Gentiles. And so he refers to himself in several passages as the apostle to the Gentiles. And we find out then from reading the book of Romans and from what we see in the book of Acts that in the last 10 to 15 years of his life, he was committed with an all-consuming passion to that calling. And so we'll see a couple of references in the book of Romans to that fact that this is what Paul devoted himself to. And so it was said this way by one commentator that Paul was a missionary first and a theologian second. So even though this is a highly theological epistle, still, we see his emphasis on his calling to take the gospel to the Gentiles. So here he is, a Jew who's zealous. He was trained in the strictest sect of our fathers, he says, when he stands before the Jews and makes remarks along these lines when he's on trial in Jerusalem and all that, those references from the book of Acts. So here he is, exceedingly zealous for the traditions of the fathers, walking in the strictest sect of the Jews, the Pharisees. But God comes and takes this man and says, I want you to go out to the Gentiles. So Paul's calling to the Gentiles and his understanding that we're going to see in the book of Romans about the law and the relationship of the law to the Christian, see, that causes actually some tension Of course, Paul's calling to the Gentile causes violent opposition from his Jewish brethren, but it causes even tension between Paul and some in the church and in the church in Jerusalem. And so you see Paul have to defend himself at length, for example, in 2 Corinthians, which he's already written by the time he writes the book of Romans. So keep that in mind. So Paul often refers to this kind of opposition that he faced. And again, this is going to come out in the book of Romans. So that tension, likely that loosened his ties with the church in Jerusalem, with the church in Antioch. Remember, that's the place from which he and Barnabas set out on their missionary journey. So Antioch was like their sponsoring church. That was their home base of operation. But now in Galatians 2, Paul has challenged Peter and some others about what happened in Antioch, about Peter's hypocrisy there. And so there seems to be still some, even though they're apostles and they're ultimately preaching the same gospel, we see a friction as the church works this out. And so it appears, and here's why we're saying all this, that one of the reasons Paul is writing the book of Romans is he wants to shift his base of operation to the church at Rome so he can then take the gospel out to Western Europe. He says he wants to go to visit you in Rome, he says, and then I want to go to Spain. I want you to help me along on my journeys to Spain. So, of course, we know he ends up going to Rome, doesn't he? But as a prisoner, not in the way that he expects. And we don't know if he ever did get to go to Spain, but I don't think there's any evidence for that. All right, so we're going to keep that in mind when we look at the letter. All these things about Paul give a whole new dimension to the Jew-Gentile controversy that he addresses at length in the letter. All right, let's think about, before we look at to whom it was written, let's think about when and where Paul wrote it. That's all a part of the historical background. All right, seems to be working better now. Thank you, Lord, for that small blessing. Now I'm frozen up again. All right, there we go. So you likely have these maps in your Bibles. Even if you have a digital Bible, likely you have an image of Paul's missionary journeys, and we're not going to trace it all the way through, but I want you to notice here that it was on his third and final missionary journey that's recorded in the book of Acts, where Paul is, there we go, Paul is down here, okay, he's come back through Macedonia, and he's come down here to Greece, and he's down here in the city of Corinth, and we're told he stayed there for 3 months. Let's look at the text. So in Acts 20 and verse 3, as Luke is telling us about Paul, he's heading back, he's making his way back to Jerusalem, and what do we find? Acts 20 and verse 3, when he had gone through, let's just start in verse 1. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and encouraging them, he said farewell. So he departed for Macedonia. And when he had gone through, so he went through Macedonia, that's what we just saw on the map. When he'd gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, think of all that happened there that we're not reading about. He just passes over. He came to Greece, okay, and there he spent 3 months. And so we can be almost certain that it was in those 3 months that Paul wrote this letter to the church at Rome. And here's why we say we can be sure he was in Corinth. At the very end of Romans in chapter 16, and there are some who think this was added to the letter later. We'll talk about that when we get there in 2024, when we get to Romans chapter 16. Where you see there seems to be an ending at the end of chapter 15, and then there's all this other material that seems almost like an appendix in chapter 16. But when you get to chapter 16, notice what he says, I commend you to our sister Phoebe, a servant of the church at Cenchrea. Well, that is right next to Corinth. And then we're going to notice, too, that at Romans 16 and verse 23, he mentions Gaius. He says, he's my host. So he's staying in the home of Gaius. He says, he's host to me. And so Gaius, who is host to me, to the whole church, greet you. And then Erastus, the city treasurer. Again, this is another indication he's in Corinth, because in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul mentions having baptized Gaius when he was there in Corinth in Acts chapter 18. So it was written from Corinth. And let's think about when it was written then. So what time frame would this put us in? And this is a bust of the infamous emperor Nero. And we're combining now from where it was written, a little bit more about when and to whom. But when we look at Paul writing to the church at Rome, and he talks about, for example, in Romans 13, to be obedient to civil authorities. And it's quite interesting to think that he was writing to the church and enjoining on them submissiveness to the government when you had an infamous persecutor of Christians who was ruling at the time, Nero. And Nero, the persecution that was stirred up in Rome by Nero is thought to have been in response to a fire, well-known incident that happened in the city of Rome, a fire that consumed much of the city. And it's thought that perhaps Nero set the fire himself to clear part of the city to build his own elaborate palace and grounds. And that then he blamed it on Christians and began a severe persecution of Christians that included, and I don't know if you can see it too well here, but if you look at this image, let me increase the size a little bit there. Look at this image and notice on this side of the image you see here Nero's palace, and there's Nero being carried, and you see all the sort of an orgy, this party that's going on. And what are they looking at? What are they looking at over here? Can you see that he has Christians tied up and bound, and it was thought that he covered them in pitch, in tar, and burned them alive and lit them up like lanterns for his garden. These are some of the horrors that the church experienced under. And then ultimately, Paul would be executed after his second imprisonment. Paul would be executed under the command of Nero. And you see Paul referring to, I believe, Nero when he talks about how the Lord the first time delivered him out of the mouth of the lion. But now he knows he's about to be martyred in his last chapter that he writes in 2 Timothy 4. And there are many, many images that depict the beheading of Paul. That was a theme that was fascinating to a lot of artists. But I think I had those slides out of place, is why I got a little flustered there. I just want you to keep in mind some of the conditions in Rome around that time and the time following when Paul wrote the letter. But Nero ruled from about 54 AD to about 68. But Paul, we can see from the scripture references that we gave, wrote from Corinth about AD 57. So shortly after the time that Nero began to reign, after Claudius, Emperor Claudius, and then we get to Nero, and Paul writes, we can probably safely say around AD 57. And that's, of course, an estimate, but that gives us a little bit of an idea of the social context the political context that Christians were facing. I know we're very concerned, of course, about the election coming up, and obviously we have reason to be concerned. But think of what the Christians were facing in a ruler like Nero and what was about to come upon them. And Paul writes this letter to him. See, that will give us additional insight, and that will help the text take on new dimension for us as well. Now, so if that's the case, that Paul wrote this from Corinth in AD 57, it's not the first letter he wrote. What is the first epistle Paul likely wrote? What do we think is, little quiz here, the very first epistle written that we have in our New Testaments? What was likely the very first letter of all the epistles in the New Testament that was written? We play a little Bible Jeopardy here. You have to answer in the form of a question. This epistle was likely the first one written among all the epistles of the New Testament. You gotta buzz in, though. James, the book of James. But what was Paul's first letter? Well, let's look at the order of Paul's letters. And we can say this with a high degree of certainty here. I keep trying to click my tools on, and there's a huge delay. It might be because this file that I made for the class is so large. All right, so notice here Paul's first letter after the council in Jerusalem that we read about in Acts 15. In about AD 50, he writes the book of Galatians. So the book of Galatians is his first letter. And then by this time, on his second missionary journey, he's already written 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And on his third missionary journey, before this point, before he's arrived at Corinth, he's already written 1 Corinthians to the church there. Then on his way there, he sends the second letter, or at least the second letter we have in our Bibles. It appears Paul wrote 3, maybe 4 letters to the church at Corinth. And then we get finally to the letter to the Romans right there. And then you see his prison epistles that come up later, and then the so-called pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, there come much later, or sometime later. But there you see Paul, this is where it fits in the list of Paul's letters. And I'm trying to change slides. Wow, if the audio recording comes out here, that will be a miracle. All right, now this, we need to think about this for a minute. To whom did Paul write? Well, we know he wrote, of course, the reason it's called the book of Romans. By the way, if this isn't his first letter, why is it first after the book of Acts? Why among Paul's letters? In our Bibles, the way we have the canon, the canonical order, we call it, of the books now, the established order of the New Testament books. Why is Romans first? Why don't we have them in chronological order? What order are they in? They're in order of length. And Romans is the longest that he wrote. So I think I'd prefer to see them in the order in which they were written. But man, that would mess up the song that we sing, right? About the books of the New Testament. I mean, we'd have to rework that whole song if we were going to change the order. Well, think about the city of Rome. Think about imperial Rome, the capital of the empire, the seat of the emperor, the ruler of the entire Mediterranean world at that time. It really does stagger the imagination to think of the power centered in the city of Rome. All roads lead to Rome. You've heard things like that. Here's a model of the city. And just imagine being in one of the congregations in someone's home spread across this city here. And here's another depiction of it where you can see the Colosseum and all of that. Isn't that incredible? So try to imagine living in the city. Now, for the wealthy, it was fairly comfortable, but for everybody else, it was crowded and smelly and, scratching out your day-to-day existence. Many, many slaves in the city of Rome at this time, and no doubt some among the church that Paul is writing to in Rome. So, of course, slavery was an integral part of the Roman Empire. And Claudius was, we're going to mention Claudius here. Let me slide him back over and just show you, though. These are some of the things we still have remaining from the city of Rome at the time Paul wrote his letter. What is that? Has anyone been to Rome here besides Russ? You have, right? He wanted to touch the foot of the statue of Peter at the Vatican, at St. Peter's Cathedral, right? What is this? Wow, you guys are going to lose at Jeopardy if you don't beef up a little here. No, this is the Arch of Titus, right? And the reason it's significant is because it contains a relief on it showing the Roman soldiers carrying away the artifacts from the temple in Jerusalem when Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and it was accomplished by Titus. And they carried off the candelabra and all that, and I've shown images of that before in other classes. By the way, just you want a little bit of idea what life might have been like? Does anyone take a guess what that might be? Yeah, there's a public toilet. So if you're looking around for a restroom in the ancient city of Rome, you might have wanted to try to wait till you got home. But it's hard for us to imagine, when you think of sanitation and all that, what it was like. But we can still see today. So let's think about Paul writing to Christians who were seeing things there in the city of Rome that we can still see today, that they would walk by and that they would know about, that were a part of their city, including the pantheon that contained the gods. This was a pagan city where there was a tremendous amount of superstition and idolatry. And that's just out of view, I believe, here. And so it's interesting to think about what they experience in that city and what we can still get glimpses of today. And the Colosseum, you remember, is where it is thought that, and here you see the Christians being thrown to the lions, brought out to be consumed by wild beasts, and some crucified, some being burned alive as everyone watches in the Colosseum. That was in Rome. Not long after, Paul wrote this letter to the church there. So you're a Christian, you're following Christ, and you're learning about who Jesus is and what God's plan is and how all this fits together and impacts your life, and you're thinking about all the things that Paul said in this letter, and then these are the things on the horizon that were about to happen to them there. That's why I introduced all of that. Now, when we think of Roman Christianity today, what do most people think of? Roman. They think of the word Rome. Maybe they see the word in their Bible that this is the book of Romans. They probably think of the Roman Catholic Church, right? And so think of how the Roman Catholic Church has come to dominate the city of Rome. For some reason, my pictures are off here. All right, there's St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. And then let me show you some other images here. Look at the Vatican there. And look at all of, we know these things came about as a result of a departure from true New Testament Christianity. And so it's only after a long series of departures and unscriptural innovations that we get to the Roman Catholic papacy. Again, centered in the city of Rome. And think of all of the idolatrous trappings of the Roman Catholic religion. And we don't mean any disrespect to our Roman Catholic friends. I'm sure they would feel quite offended that we're being critical of their religion. But when we look at these things, think about this. When you look at all of this, do you get any hint of that at all when you read the book of Romans? about a priesthood and a papacy and all of those other, the Mass and all of those other things. Not a hint of any kind of thing like that at all when Paul writes to the church right there in Rome. Think about that. That alone ought to give someone pause in thinking about Roman Catholicism. All right, here's what we want to know about the saints in Rome. There is a strong Jewish community there. In the mid-first century, we think there was maybe as many as 40,000 to 50,000 Jews there. So imagine 40 to 50,000 Jews, maybe in one quarter of the city mainly, or a couple parts of the city, and all the synagogues that will be spread over their neighborhoods. That's where the church in Rome began, right? In Acts chapter 2, what do we read about when the gospel was first preached by Peter? Who is there when Peter talks about Jews who were there from every nation under heaven virtually? What does he say? Included in that list in Acts 2 and verse 10, there were visitors from Rome. And so this is likely then, these visitors from Rome hear the gospel preached around AD 30 or so, and they're there for the Pentecost, and they travel back to Rome. And these Messianic Jews, Jews who were looking for the Messiah, they bring this message back to the other Jews in the synagogues back in Rome and teach the gospel, and there the church begins to spread. And so that is likely how the church began, the church in Rome. Now, let me list a few more things before our time is out. And I'll try to get this, whatever issue I'm having here, worked out by next time. Hope it wasn't too distracting for you. So initially, the church there would have been composed of Jews and those whom we call God-fearers. Now, as we said a moment ago, likely a lot of them were slaves and many were freedmen, meaning former slaves who had been set free. And in the synagogues, you had Jews and then you had God-fearers. That is, Gentiles who believed in God and who believed the one God as the God of Israel and who joined themselves to the synagogue but didn't go so far, and I can understand this, as actually practicing circumcision and bringing themselves under the law of Moses as proselytes. But they're connected to the synagogue. We see that in the Gospels, hints of that. So you've got Jews, and then the only Gentiles you would have would be those God-fearers. And remember, too, that to the public, early on in the church's history, Christians were thought of as part of the larger Jewish community. Again, that helps us understand why there's so much controversy about Jew and Gentile when you're reading the book of Romans. Christians were not yet clearly distinguished from the wider Jewish community. The members met in house churches. Now, why do we say that? Think about this. Imagine if we didn't have this one congregation here. I want you to give this some thought. We're about to close. We have reason to believe this because Paul doesn't say, as he does in his other letters typically, he'll say, I'm writing to the church in Corinth or the churches of Galatia. You see that when he writes his epistles to the Thessalonians. He refers to the church. He doesn't do that in Romans. He doesn't do that in Romans, but what does he do? He talks about the church meeting in people's homes. Look at Romans 16, for example, with me, and I've listed these passages on the previous slide, but Paul mentions in Romans 16:3, he says, greet Prisca and Aquila, that's Priscilla and Aquila, and then he says in verse 5, greet also the church in their house. The church that's in their house. All right, let's finish with this. Let me just slide this up and you'll see a couple more references like that. He says, great Apelles, who is approved in Christ, and those who belong to the family of Aristobulus. And then he mentions in verse 11, greet those in the Lord who belong to the family of Narcissus. Okay, and then one more, go down to verses 14 and 15, and Paul says, Notice when he lists these brothers, he says, and the brothers who are with them. In verse 15, and all the saints who are with them. So likely this is showing you had groups of Christians meeting in house churches across the city. Now, how would that affect our lives as Christians? We got a little bit of that, didn't we, when COVID hit, right? Did any of you meet in a small group? Some of you did, right? Meet in small groups in people's homes. And I know of other congregations that did that, where one group met in the annex of 10 and under, and then some met in the auditorium, and then some met in the preacher's house, which was right next door, and some met in another person's home. But imagine if that's your life as a Christian in the church. How would that impact you when you hear Paul's letter read? And how would you be living out the Christian life in the Christian community spread out over the city of Rome in these house churches? See, when we read the letter, that's to whom was writing. So we'll continue with this, Lord willing, next time and look at then why. The big point we're leading to is, all right, we see who wrote it, when and where. We see to whom he wrote it. Why did he write it? And what are some of the themes in theology? What are the key texts? Lord willing, we'll get to that next time. Thank you for your good attention this morning. God bless you. Let's have a blessed time of worship together.